November 20th, 1917, 6:20 am. The Cambrai sector, northern France. Through the pre-dawn fog, German sentries manning the Hindenburg Line peer into the mist with the confidence of men who have held their ground against 3 years of slaughter. Machine gunners adjust their Maxim MG-08's water-cooled barrels gleaming with condensation. They have seen it all: waves of British infantry cut down like wheat before the scythe, entire battalions erased in minutes by interlocking fields of fire. The mathematics of modern warfare are simple here. Barbed wire plus machine gun equals invincibility. Then, through the fog comes a sound never heard before in such numbers, a mechanical roar, the grinding of metal on metal. The earth itself shudders. What emerges from the mist is something from a fever dream: monstrous rhomboidal shapes, 30 feet long, covered in steel plates, crushing barbed wire beneath their tracks as though it were spider's silk. The Germans had heard rumors, of course. The British landships. Their intelligence had laughed at the reports, the first models at the Somme, lumbering mechanical absurdities that broke down more often than they fired their guns. Land cruisers, they called them mockingly, coffins on tracks. But this is different. This time, there are 476 of them. Brigadier-General Hugh Elles stands in the hatch of a Mark I tank nicknamed Hilda, carrying the tank corps flag, red, brown and green stripes, representing through mud and blood to the green fields beyond. He has personally chosen to lead from the front, to share the risk with his men. The British High Command had been skeptical themselves. Traditionalists called tanks a waste of resources. The cavalry will break through, they insisted, even as thousands of horses lay rotting in no man's land, machine-gunned alongside their riders. After the dismal performance at Passchendaele, many advocated abandoning tank development entirely. This is the story of how an impossible machine, born from desperation and derided by friend and foe alike, transformed from a mechanical curiosity into an instrument of terror that would shatter the most formidable defensive system in human history, and in doing so, render obsolete the entire doctrine of static trench warfare that had consumed a generation. The Mark I tank was not conceived in triumph, but in horror. By 1916, the Western Front had calcified into a 450-mile scar across Europe. The machine gun, particularly the German Maxim, had created a killing field so efficient that infantry advances measured success in yards, not miles, and in lives spent by the tens of thousands. At the Battle of the Somme, British forces suffered 57 fewer casualties on a single day. The mathematics were brutal and unavoidable. Flesh and bone could not defeat steel and mathematics. In London, Winston Churchill, then First Lord of the Admiralty, championed a radical concept. What if the machine gun could be taken out of the equation? What if a vehicle could cross the trenches, crush the wire, and deliver firepower directly to the enemy? The result was the Landship Committee, a collection of engineers, naval architects and dreamers who designed what would become the tank. The name itself was born from deception. To maintain secrecy, workers were told they were building water carriers for Mesopotamia. Tanks, they called them. The name stuck. The first model, the Mark I, debuted at the Somme in September 1916. It was revolutionary. It was also deeply flawed. Of the 49 tanks that started the attack, only 32 made it to the starting line. Of those, 9 crossed the German trenches. The rest broke down, ditched, or were abandoned by crews overcome by the 100-degree heat inside, poisoned by carbon monoxide fumes, and deafened by the mechanical cacophony. German soldiers initially fled in terror, but they quickly learned. The Mark I was slow, barely 3 miles per hour. Its armor could be penetrated by armor-piercing bullets. Its tracks threw off frequently. It was a mechanical nightmare. For the crews, service in these early tanks was a descent into hell. Tank Commander Captain D.G. Brown, who would serve at Cambrai, described conditions in his memoir. The noise was indescribable: 8 men shouting to communicate over the roar of the engine, the clatter of the tracks, the hammering of bullets against the hull. The temperature climbed above 100 degrees Fahrenheit. The air was thick with carbon monoxide and cordite fumes. Men vomited into their helmets. They collapsed from heat exhaustion. And all the while they were shaken so violently that they could not stand, could not aim, could barely hold consciousness. The psychological toll was immense. Tank crews suffered from what became known as tank shock, a combination of carbon monoxide poisoning, heat stroke, and profound disorientation. Men emerged from tanks with faces blackened by diesel fumes, hands blistered from touching superheated metal, ears bleeding from the concussive force of shells striking the hull. The British High Command was divided. General Haig, Supreme Commander of British forces, saw potential but demanded improvements. The War Office, skeptical and conservative, viewed tanks as an expensive experiment. Traditional cavalry officers actively campaigned against them, seeing the tank as a threat to their way of warfare. Sergeant J.C. Allnat, a tank driver, recorded his frustration before Cambrai. It was unfortunate that the decision to send tanks rested with the officers in high places. If these officers had been to see the salient, and if they had had the brains of a child, they surely would not have committed the tank crews to practically certain death. The Mark I and Mark I Hoey were stopgap measures, minor improvements that did little to address the fundamental problems. But the Mark IV, introduced in 1917, was different. Engineers had learned from the blood-soaked lessons of the Somme. The Mark I featured thicker armor 12mm instead of 8, capable of resisting German armor-piercing bullets. The fuel tanks were moved outside the hull, reducing fire risk. The crew was reduced to 8 men, improving coordination. Most critically, the Mark IV came in 2 variants. Male tanks armed with 2 6-pounder guns and 3 machine guns, and female tanks armed with 5 machine guns for anti-infantry work. The training was brutal. Tanks broke down constantly, men were injured by mechanical failures, tracks snapping and striking limbs, engines backfiring and burning faces. The tanks were so loud that hand signals became the primary means of communication. Crews developed their own sign language, their own rituals. By November 1917, 470's tanks, mostly Mark IVs with some older models, had been assembled near Cambrai. The plan was audacious, a massive armoured assault without preliminary artillery bombardment, using surprise and mechanical force to break through the Hindenburg Line, the most sophisticated defensive system ever constructed. The Germans had designed the Hindenburg Line as impregnable. Multiple trench lines, 6 feet deep and reinforced with concrete. Barbed wire entanglements 30 yards deep in places, bristling with steel stakes. Concrete pillboxes housing Maxim machine guns with overlapping fields of fire, reverse slopes concealing artillery positions. It was the culmination of 3 years of defensive engineering, a fortress without walls, a killing ground perfected by experience. The night before the attack, tank crews tried to sleep, though sleep was impossible. Outside, 476 tanks idled in the darkness, their engines growling like caged beasts, waiting for dawn. At 6:10 am on November 20, 1917, over 1,000 British guns opened fire, but this was no prolonged bombardment that would alert the Germans it lasted only 10 minutes. At 6:20 am, 476 tanks charged forward across a 6-mile front, emerging from the fog like metal leviathans, accompanied by infantry trained specifically to follow in their wake. Inside the tanks, crews gripped vision slits, watching the world compress into narrow rectangles of metal and mud. The noise was apocalyptic. Engines roared at maximum power. Tracks screeched against drive wheels. The 6-pounder guns began firing, each shot transmitted through the hull like a physical blow. What happened next defied 3 years of military experience. The Mark IVs hit the wire and kept going. The tracks, each link weighing dozens of pounds, crushed the steel barbs flat. Posts that had been sunk deep into the earth were ripped out and dragged under. The tanks didn't slow, didn't hesitate. They rolled over obstacles that would have stopped entire battalions dead. German machine gunners opened fire, barrels glowing red-hot as they poured 450 rounds per minute into the approaching monsters. The bullets sparked off the armor. The Mark IV's 12mm plates held. The armor-piercing rounds ricocheted into the fog. Then the 6-pounders spoke. High-explosive shells struck concrete pillboxes. Structures designed to withstand artillery cracked and crumbled. Machine gun positions that had killed thousands became tombs in seconds. All along the line, the same scene repeated. German machine gunners, who had mowed down hundreds of thousands of British soldiers with industrial efficiency, found themselves helpless. Their guns, their wire, their trenches, the entire architecture of defensive warfare meant nothing against these machines. Captain D.G. Brown reported from his tank, "The German outposts, dazed or annihilated by the sudden deluge of shells, were overrun in an instant. Down the whole line tanks were dipping and rearing up and clawing their way across into the almost unravaged country beyond. The defenders of the line were running panic-stricken, casting away arms and equipment. Inside the tanks, crews fought their own battle. Temperatures climbed to 120 degrees. Men collapsed from heat exhaustion and had to be revived with water from engine cooling systems. Carbon monoxide was so thick that men took turns at the vision slits, gasping for relatively fresh air. Every impact of German shells against the hull rang like a bell, leaving crew members dazed and bleeding from their ears. But they kept moving. The tactics evolved in real time. Male tanks targeted pillboxes and strongpoints with their 6-pounders. Female tanks swept trenches with machine gun fire, suppressing any infantry who tried to organize resistance. Infantry followed in the wake of the tanks, mopping up survivors and securing captured positions. It was combined arms warfare in its purest form, and it was devastating. By mid-morning, British forces had penetrated up to 5 miles into German territory, farther than any advance since 1914. Tank crews, barely conscious from fumes and exhaustion, witnessed something they had never thought possible. German soldiers surrendering en masse, throwing down weapons, emerging from trenches with hands raised. The Hindenburg Line, the fortress that had consumed millions of shells and hundreds of thousands of lives, had been breached in hours. Historian and staff officer J.F.C. Fuller wrote, "The psychological impact was total. The Germans had built their entire defensive doctrine around the machine gun and the trench. In a single morning, that doctrine became obsolete. The tank had not merely defeated the German defenses, it had rendered them irrelevant. The scale of the breakthrough shocked both sides. British forces advanced 5 miles on the first day, more than had been gained in 3 months at Passchendaele. Church bells rang in London for the first time since 1914, announcing victory. But the tank's true power was not just mechanical, it was psychological. German soldiers who had held their ground against artillery barrages and infantry assaults broke and ran from machines that seemed unstoppable. The mythology of German invincibility, built on 3 years of defensive success, shattered. The Battle of Cambrai was not a complete victory. The British lacked the reserves to exploit the breakthrough fully, and German counterattacks beginning on November 30th recovered much of the lost ground by early December. On the first day alone, 79 tanks were lost, 65 knocked out by enemy fire, 71 to mechanical failure, and 43 to other causes. By December 6th, when fighting ended, British casualties totaled approximately 45,000, German casualties about 41,000, yet the strategic implications were undeniable. The tank had proven itself not as a novelty, but as a war-winning weapon. By the end of 1917, the British Army was producing Mark I tanks at increasing rates. The industrial might of the British Empire, which had struggled to find an answer to trench warfare, now poured resources into tank production. Factories that had built locomotives and tractors retooled for war machines. By the end of the war, Britain had produced approximately 2,600 tanks total, while France produced nearly 4,000, a combined Allied total of over 6,500 tanks. Germany, entering the race too late, produced only 20 A7Vs. The Germans, reeling from Cambrai, began their own tank program, but they were too late. The industrial logic that had given birth to the tank favored the Allies, who could outproduce Germany in steel, oil, and manufacturing capacity. A Mark I tank, once mocked as a mechanical absurdity, a landship too slow and fragile to matter, had become an instrument of terror and the key to breaking the deadlock of trench warfare. The Mark I tank participated in every major British offensive from Cambrai until the armistice. By the war's end, combined British and French tank forces numbered over 6,500 vehicles. The psychological and tactical impact was decisive. German defensive positions that would have required months to reduce with artillery and infantry assaults were broken in hours. General Erich Ludendorff, architect of Germany's defensive strategy and one of the architects of the Hindenburg Line, wrote bitterly about August 8, 1918, the Battle of Amiens, where mass tank attacks again proved devastating. August 8, 1918, the Black Day of the German Army. The British tanks broke through our lines as though they did not exist. Our men, who had held against every previous assault, broke and ran. The discipline that had sustained us through 4 years of war collapsed in the face of these machines. We had no answer to them. The Mark I itself was not perfect. It was slow, mechanically unreliable, and brutally uncomfortable for its crews. Tank Corps losses from November 20th to December 1st, 1917 totaled 68 officers and men killed, wounded or missing, with 12 tanks destroyed by shellfire and another 64 mechanically defective beyond repair. But the Mark I achieved what no amount of artillery or infantry could. It restored mobility to warfare. It transformed World War I from a static war of attrition into a war of movement in its final year. Most critically, it broke the psychological stranglehold of the machine gun and the trench, proving that defensive positions, no matter how sophisticated, could be overcome. Over 2,200 Mark I tanks were built during the war. They fought on the Western Front in Palestine and at the Battle of Amiens. Ironically, the Germans captured dozens of abandoned Mark-Ives during their counterattacks at Cambrai and used approximately 40 of them in 1918, more than their own A7V production. The legacy of the Mark-Ive extended far beyond World War I. Every modern tank, from the German Panzers of World War I to contemporary main battle tanks, traces its lineage to the crude rhomboidal machines that rolled through the fog at Cambrai. The doctrine of combined arms warfare, tanks, infantry, artillery and air power working in concert, was born in the mud of France in 1917 and reached its full potential at Amiens in August 1919, beginning the 100 Days offensive that led to Allied victory. Brigadier-General Hugh Elles, who led the tank assault from Hilda, continued to command the tank corps until the war's end. His decision to lead from the front became legendary within the corps. As one officer wrote, to lead his command was to give life and soul to all our preparations. It was spiritually the making of the tank corps. The Mark-Ive tank was not elegant, it was not sophisticated. It was a brute force solution to an impossible problem, built from desperation by a nation that had exhausted every other option, but in the end, it was enough. It broke the Hindenburg Line. It shattered the myth of German invincibility. It transformed ridicule into terror and obsolescence into dominance. In the calculus of war, brilliance and courage are not always sufficient. The Mark-Ive tank was the embodiment of that truth, ugly, brutal, and utterly unstoppable. The age of the cavalry was over. The age of the machine had begun, and the world would never be the same. The Battle of Cambrai is still commemorated annually by the Royal Tank Regiment on November 20th, Cambrai Day, with ceremonial gunfire, rum and tea, served at 6:27:20 am, the exact moment the attack began over a century ago.